you and good afternoon. May I ask you to please stand up for a second? Now consider the following question. Would you like to move to a different seat? Just monitor what goes through your mind as you decide, should I stay or should I move? Okay, now you can sit again. So I could tell from your body language, from your facial expressions, that some of you were somewhat annoyed by my question. You took great care to get here early in the morning to get the seats that you had. You came back to that seat after lunch, and our habits get established very quickly. But at the same time, your reaction to this question actually illustrates a very important phenomenon in the real world, which is status quo bias. It's our inability, our unwillingness to change, even in those situations where we know that change would be for the better. As a result of that, our eating habits lead to obesity. Our consumption habits lead to probably a non-very prosperous retirement. And our energy use habits are threatening to make large parts of our planet uninhabitable in the not-too-distant future. The bottom line is that change is hard, and that the status quo bias oftentimes also comes with a lack of imagination. Here's what Henry Ford said 100 years or so ago. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Now, in hindsight, and with respect of climate change, maybe faster horses wouldn't have been such a bad idea. But it's hard to argue that the automobile was not a great invention at its time. So the question is, what is there about change that prevents us from engaging in it? It turns out that change oftentimes looks not so good. It looks ugly. These boots that came to us 15 years or so ago from Australia, and apologies to all the Australians here, actually are called Uggs because they actually are quite ugly. But repeated exposure and familiarity breeds liking. And what's true for Uggs is also true for Crocs. And it turns out also true for Donald Trump. Okay, on a more serious note, I want to tell you now about two psychological theories that predict that status quo bias is something that we should expect to see, and more importantly, also tell us how it comes about. And by telling us what the underlying mechanisms are, we can use these mechanisms and apply some psychological jujitsu to redesign our choice environments in a way that makes status quo bias somewhat less likely to occur. And so prospect theory is a theory that earned Danny Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. One of its centerpieces is something called loss aversion. Loss aversion refers to the fact that we hate giving up something about twice as much as we enjoy getting it in the first place. Yeah. Of course, that's bad news for change, right? Because change involves trade-off. We give up something old to get something new. But if we hate giving up the old twice as much as we enjoy getting the new, chances are we're not going to trade very often, unless the other option is overwhelmingly positive. Query theory is a theory that I developed with Eric Johnson at Columbia Business School at the Center for Decision Sciences. And it describes decision-making as a process of arguing with ourselves. We draw on past experience to generate arguments for one option, should I stay? For the other option, should I move? And then we choose the one that has a larger weight of evidence for it. Now, it turns out that it's very important which option you consider first, because as you think about what's good about staying where I am, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for the other alternatives. As you then turn to evaluating what's good about moving, they have a harder time coming to the surface, and therefore we generate fewer arguments for subsequent queries. There's a huge first query advantage in generating arguments. So the million-dollar question in many situations is, what option gets considered first? And turns out the status quo is one very, very important answer to that question. It makes a lot of sense to first think about what's good, what we have, what's good, what we've been doing for a while. Yeah? But the problem is that then also that generates to fewer arguments for subsequent queries. Another important answer to this question, which option gets considered first, are our gut-level reactions to option labels. And so let me give you an example of that. A few years ago, I was puzzled by the following phenomenon. Most Americans hate taxes, and often, in particular, carbon taxes. And at the same time, the uptake of voluntary carbon fees that people pay, for example, to fly across the country without feeling guilty about it, carbon offsets, has been doubling every year since they've been in existence. So the question is, are those different people who hate the taxes but buy the offsets? Or is there something about the label tax that puts people off? And so we did a large online survey in the United States where we give people a choice between buying an inclusive airline ticket, one that includes a carbon user fee, or one that doesn't. Everybody sees 2 pages of text that explain why the offset, why the fee is being priced the way it is, how the money is going to be used to offset the carbon emissions that you generate. But half of the respondents have this fee described to them as a carbon tax, and the other one as a carbon offset. At the end of the study, also, we asked them a whole bunch of demographic questions, including political party affiliation. So here's what we find. When the carbon fee is being described as a carbon offset, about 60% of respondents actually buy it. And it doesn't matter what your political party affiliation is, Democratic, Independent, or Republican, it's all the same. When the same people get the same information with the word carbon tax, it doesn't matter for the Democrats, they still buy it 60%, but it goes down to 27% for the Republicans, and the Independents somewhere in between. Now, before people make that decision, we ask them to think out loud, or since it's online, type out loud what goes through their mind as they make this decision, just as I asked you at the beginning to monitor what you were thinking about. And so here are a couple of thought listings from actual respondents. Good for the environment, carbon offset not much more. What does this extra money do to offset the carbon? Here's a different person. Why would I ever pay extra for this? But you don't care about the tax, same thing, get rid of the tax. Government needs to stop taxing us. Old and dead by the time this world has an energy crisis. But this, I mean, a huge one where we're all effed. And this is a ridiculous thought to have. Now, we can now use these protocols, these thought listings, as a way of testing theory, testing query theory. And so the question is, do these arguments for one option, paying the fee, or the other option, not paying the fee, are they randomly interspersed, or do they actually get generated in a clustered fashion? And which of these questions get considered first? And is the first query actually generating more arguments? If I first think about paying the fee, do I generate more arguments for paying the fee? And in combination, does the clustering and the related frequency then predict people's choices? Okay, just to show you our analysis of the clustering, it shows the same kind of pattern we saw for people's preferences. The same is true for the frequency of arguments. And in combination, these 2 factors, clustering and frequency, predict people's choices very well. Now, more than predicting choices very well, they also are a recipe for intervention. Yeah? And in a follow-up study, we actually asked those people, those Republicans who saw the label carbon tax, to first, now explicitly, first generate arguments for buying the inclusive ticket. Now, it turns out not everybody followed instructions. It's actually not true that people will do what scientists tell them. Sometimes they don't, and especially when the labeled carbon tax is so offensive to them. But those Republicans who did first generate arguments for buying the inclusive ticket generated more arguments and were more likely to buy the inclusive ticket. Okay, so now that we understand how status quo bias comes about, can we also maybe try to predict what might happen when somebody changes the status quo on us, maybe against our better judgment? And what should happen, of course, is that the hated change now becomes the new status quo, and especially if it's a change for the better. Yeah? The first query advantage should kick in after a period of time. We first should think about, okay, what's good about the new status quo? And so the question is, does this happen in the real world? And how long is that transition period? Because that might be important information if you're about to change the status quo against public opposition. And let me show you 3 case studies. The first one is the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco. It was built in the 1960s, and very shortly after its inception, activists were trying to get it removed because it actually is pretty ugly. But there was strong opposition against that from merchants in Chinatown who were fearing loss of customers, from traffic engineers. But it took an act of God to change the default. The 1989 earthquake destroyed the infrastructure, and then it took less than a year for the city council to vote not to rebuild the highway. It's very hard to argue that the new Embarcadero is not a huge aesthetic and economic improvement in generating millions of additional dollars in tourist revenue for the city of San Francisco every year. The other 2 examples where the status quo was changed against public opposition come from situations where we had a brave and responsible politician who did it. Mayor Bloomberg in 2002 imposed a smoking ban on all public buildings in New York City, including bars and restaurants. And in 2008, the Premier of British Columbia imposed one of the first carbon taxes in the province of British Columbia, in both cases against huge public opposition. And we did a media analysis of metropolitan newspapers in each area, looking at what the net public sentiment was at the time of announcement of this program. As you can see, public opinion goes south after announcement. It bottoms out at implementation, and then it slowly becomes net positive again. In this case, it took 14 months for the smoking ban to become the poster child for responsible public policy when it comes to health and smoking. And you see the same pattern for the BC government, basically bottoming out at implementation. In this case, it takes 8 months to come back. So this is something worth remembering for politicians. You can change public policy against public opposition and still get reelected, because these numbers are still well within people's election cycles. Okay, let's put these lessons to work. And let's think about what we can do to transition, for example, the US economy to a clean energy economy. We can use mandates, of course, and regulations. We know regulations oftentimes get held up in court. Mandates don't work so well. Germany banned the regular light bulb in 2009, and everybody started hoarding the old light bulbs, including my grandmother. We can tax carbon emissions, and that's great, but we should remember not to call it a tax, but an offset or a user fee. Okay? Or we can use choice architecture, for example, put into place energy-efficient lighting technology or heating and cooling technology in building codes. Turns out that green defaults work extremely well all around the world where they've been tried. Consumers actually very rarely switch away from their default, even after they realize that they come with costs, with additional costs. And so we recently wondered whether we could bring choice architecture back to architecture, in particular to infrastructure design. And so it turns out that many engineers justify their energy infrastructure decisions with respect to building codes and building also rating systems. So many of you will be familiar with the LEED certification. If you have a LEED Platinum building, that gives you bragging rights. You can charge higher rents. You can attract more attractive customers and renters for your building. We worked with a similar system in Vision. It just applies to a broader range of infrastructure projects, not just buildings. And so right now, engineers look at Envision, and they answer questions about 60 different decisions respective to sustainability and infrastructure. And right now, the status quo is the current industry practice, and they earn points for doing better than that. And if you earn enough points, you get these different levels of certification. Well, we thought, what would happen if we endow engineers with the second most ambitious level, the conserving level? They can still switch away from it, but they lose points when they do that. Yeah? And we just basically simply pre-check that option for them in the software. They can change it, but it's pre-checked. Now, notice we put both prospect theory and query theory to use here, because to change away from the conserving level, you lose points, and presumably that hurts more than gaining points makes you feel good. And secondly, by pre-checking the conserving level, engineers might first think about what's good about the conserving level, and then think about what's good about lower levels. Did it make a difference? Well, it turns out yes. Just a simple change in the HTML code of the software resulted in designs that were 24% more sustainable. Very simple intervention, huge results. Okay, let me summarize. I think all of us in this room would agree that individual change, organizational change, political change, social change, in many situations is very desirable, but in the abstract. When it comes to concrete changes, that's the situation where our sometimes dysfunctional mental habits kick in and prevent us from change. And so the question is, what can we do to minimize those interferences and how to give change a chance? And I think there are two takeaways. First of all is we should expect the status quo bias. It's something to be expected. It shouldn't be a surprise, but we also should expect its transience. And this should embolden our politicians, our policymakers, to make the changes that actually increase public welfare, and not to be afraid that they might not get reelected. You know, they can lead public opinion rather than follow it. And secondly, we can all become choice architects for ourselves or for others. There's nothing manipulative about changing the choice design. There is no value-neutral choice design. Any kind of presentation of information predisposes you towards one option or the other. So why not use that kind of design that makes it more likely for us to actually follow through on our long-term needs and goals? So how do we do that? Well, I suggested to you we can use very judicious labels for choice alternatives, avoid hot-button issues. Secondly, we can put into place beneficial defaults. And thirdly, we first should think about why we should change and why we can change, and not why we can't. So finally, just look around and look at all of these strangers you failed to meet because your status quo bias, and maybe after the coffee break, think about changing your seat one more time. Thank you.